Hi students, so we're going to look at prejudice and discrimination today. We're going to apply this to our ascribed status chapters in our social stratification unit, but they also relate to some of the achievement situation in the first couple of chapters in this unit, chapter 7 and chapter 8, when Max Weber especially talked about wealth, power, and prestige being three components that we wrap together to mentally form an idea about stratification in our society. And when we first learned about wealth, power, and prestige, I told you to equate those to the achieved statuses that we put into socioeconomics, which is income, occupation, and education. But now I'm going to ask you to add some nuances to all three of those things, wealth, power, and prestige, and let's look to see whether society perhaps is shaped in a certain way on the macro scale so that even though a society like the USA is supposed to be the place where you can achieve the American dream, are there obstacles that some face because of their ascribed statuses and others don't face those obstacles? So there's a buzzword in society today about privilege. What group is privileged, or is there Christian privilege or white privilege or all these different types of male privilege? These different kinds of privileges come from the idea of society being designed with unforeseen obstacles in place for some people of some ascribed statuses, but not others of other ascribed statuses. So you can go back to the dominant versus subordinate group list, those characteristics, and you can look to see. I didn't specifically name who in this society would be the haves versus the have-nots, or who in Saudi Arabian society or South African society or Chinese society would be the haves or the have-nots as far as dominant versus subordinate. But those things affect our ability for social mobility within a social stratification system. And it also affects just the attitude that exists in society overall that affects our individual attitudes as we go through our socialization process and grow up with Americanisms or estadounidenseisms, I should say. USA people are just one type of American. So there's something that's within our idea in the United States. If you were reared in the United States, you might say the word American and mean USA. However, we've got two countries in North America, we've got lots of countries in Central America, we've got tons of countries in South America, and guess what? America is the ending of all those. So everybody's American, right? From Alaska down to Chile in South America. We're all American, so we are United Statesian Americans, and our particular socialization process, for the most part, or historically, tends to think of ourselves as the only Americans on the planet. So there's like an example of some biases, some hidden biases. Now, not all biases are malicious or intentional. I'm not saying that, but there are some hidden biases that exist. So we learn prejudices, we learn discriminatory behaviors over time, and we might not even know it. Okay, so it's not like necessarily all of the actions that fall under prejudice, all of the attitudes that fall under prejudice, or all of the actions that fall under discrimination would necessarily be intentional or purposeful. Not necessarily. Okay, so let's look at prejudice and discrimination, and the biggest difference between these two things is attitude versus action. So attitude comes from just the idea, there's some overgeneralizations, faulty assumptions about a general group's behaviors or attitudes or beliefs, and that are basically founded in ethnocentrism. So we can look all the way back to, I think it was Chapter 2, when was that? January, when we first learned about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. So prejudice is an attitude that really comes out of ethnocentrism. It's a faulty overgeneralization about somebody's way of life, their standard of living. If you're poor, that must mean you don't work hard, because in the United States, you're supposed to be able to work hard and get ahead. So if you're poor, it's your own fault. There's an attitude of prejudice against impoverished people that a lot of of people have in the United States. Think about homelessness. Think about homeless people that we see on the street. Do we look at them as somebody who has the same social value as we do, or do we look at them with pity or with disdain or with disgust, or what are those kinds of attitudes that are built into our personalities over our learning process, over our socialization process? Those attitudes are called prejudice. But action is called discrimination. The action of limiting somebody's chances, limiting somebody's equal outcome after they have a certain experience compared to another group of people who go through that same process. Are the outcomes different for different groups of people? So actions are discrimination. Attitude is prejudice. Discrimination, as I mentioned before, it can be intentional. I don't do this, but I can intentionally pick out all the female names on my roster and make sure that I give them bonus points so that they pass, and I neglect to do the same for males. I don't do that, but it's an example. That would be an action, an individual action on my part, intentional, where I'm discriminating on the basis of an ascribed behavior. And that's not good. It's illegal also. So we've put some checks and balances in place in our society. So those kinds of things are illegal. Now, I don't know that I would be arrested and put through the court system if I actually did such a thing. But definitely if my supervisor found out, which, I wouldn't get away with it for long. If my supervisor found out, I would at least get a major talking to, or probably be fired for that kind of thing, probably. I doubt they'd give me another chance if they found out that I was doing something as horrible as that. So discrimination is actions. It can be unintentional or intentional, based in a preconceived bias or an overgeneralization or that prejudice. So really, this is kind of like the first step, but if you don't take the second step, which actually puts these attitudes into action, then there's not discrimination to talk about. But when you're reading, let me see, so both chapter 9 and chapter 10 have issues that relate to prejudice and discrimination within them. I believe it's chapter 9, however, where you will first read the terms prejudice and discrimination and have some text to use to differentiate between the two terms. And then also you will read about something called individual discrimination or institutional discrimination. So I have the word personal here. You can use the word individual discrimination or personal discrimination interchangeably. That just simply means, think of it this way and put it in your notes this way, please. That means micro level discrimination. So the example I just gave of if I used people's names that I perceived were female versus names that I perceived were male and I graded them differently, that would be individually I am doing that discrimination. Which I'm not. Do I need to say that again? It's not happening. But that would be an example of personal or individual discrimination. I, as an individual, am taking an action based on my attitude. But where did I get that attitude? There's always going to be that connection between the micro and the macro. Remember, I think it was week 1, again, way back in January, when we were talking about this for the first time. So, so personal versus institutional discrimination. The institutional discrimination kind of has 2 layers because institutional, we use this word kind of 2 different ways, the word institutional. In casual conversation, we use it 2 different ways. So for instance, UAPTC is an institution of higher education. So did you see my air quotes there? So it's an institution of higher education. However, really what we mean there is an organization, such as Harp's grocery store is an organization, a business, okay? So it's an organization. You could call it an institution. Usually if things are part of state government, like PTC is, you would call it an institution. However, please, let's make sure that we distinguish, especially at this point in the semester, let's make sure that we distinguish fully between middle level stuff in society, which if you study sociology further, if you go further than just this introductory class that we have together, you'll start to see that we do differentiate between macro and micro with something called the meso level. So there is a meso level, and when you're reading in your textbook, you will read about organizations and institutions that bring about different outcomes for the different categories of people that transition through those organizations or institutions. But when I say institutional discrimination, and when we're going to talk about it in our next lecture, I'm really talking about the mega macro, the most macro that you can get, because social structure is controlled by something we call social facts and social norms. So please go back and early on in the semester, look it up right now, look up what social facts is so that you can get it fresh in your mind. There is a patterned way that people in our society think, feel, and act. We are trained through our socialization process to think, feel, and act a certain way. And those patterns come from the mega macro level. Okay? Social institutions are going to be the topic for all of our lectures between now and the end of the semester. The mega macro level social institutions. Now, we've been talking about social institutions again. I keep going back to the beginning of the semester, but we've been talking about social institutions since then. But please turn your brain from the micro level that some of us are still stuck in, and it's not easy to get unstuck from the micro level, because that's where we exist, right? We're our most important person in life, and so we have a hard time sometimes transitioning from our level to macro level, but that's where our brains have got to be for the rest of this semester, so we fully develop that sociological imagination. Look at me using another vocabulary word from the beginning of the semester, sociological imagination. We have an entire course learning outcome in this class together. I think it's course learning outcome number 2 on the syllabus that talks about developing and demonstrating that you're able to use your sociological imagination. And so that means that you are going to be looking for institutional level stuff in the social structure that affects individuals on the micro scale, because our socialization process teaches us the patterned ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that exist on the macro scale but affect us or even control our behaviors on the micro scale. And so most of the rest of the semester, that's what we're going to be doing, is making those macro and micro connections, because we got to master that course learning outcome number 2. We've really hammered it all semester, but you haven't really demonstrated it. I haven't asked you to demonstrate that for me yet. And so project 4, guess what I'm going to ask you to demonstrate? You got it, the sociological imagination. So we don't have that word written over again in our notes for this particular unit, but you know what? I suggest you stop right now and make a great big old size 18 font thing in your notes that says sociological imagination. Review it. You can go to Khan Academy on YouTube and find a review that's different from old Mrs. T's review that I did way back at the beginning of the semester, although you can find mine too because it's golden, right? So, prejudice and discrimination, there are some institutions in our society, social institutions, that have built into that structure discriminatory practices. For instance, I think I used marriage in a previous lecture. So the marriage pattern that is approved of in the United States is monogamy. We're going to talk about that more in next week maybe, or the week after. But monogamy is 2 people at one time, one pair. Mono means one. So it's one spouse married to another spouse, and that's it. It's not like 4 spouses married to one spouse. It's one spouse and one spouse. Okay? And so notice I'm even saying the word spouse because in recent years, recent decades in the United States, the legal system has changed so that we use those gender non-specific terms because we in sociology are not going to say whether monogamy should, look at my air quotes, should be male-female, but we recognize that according to the legal system in the governmental structure of the USA, male and female are also permitted. Okay, so sociology is not going to make a commentary about morality there. However, on the mega macro scale, is there a dominant ideology that affects the morality of a dominant number of people in the United States, meaning Christians? The answer would be yes.